All right, you're sitting in a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue that actually dates back to the 4th century. Part of it has stones from the 2nd century, but primarily the 3rd century, 3rd and 4th century. But it was built on the on foundations that were the synagogue at the time of Jesus. And so there's a good possibility, if not a probability, that this is where Jesus was when he taught here in Capernaum. We know that there were 3 synagogues here in this general area, but this is the one that we know definitely where the location was. And back behind us was actually behind and back that direction was the Fora Consortium. It was the largest outdoor facility built by Herod the Great. And it was there where Jesus, remember the man that was laid right down through the roof? Well, that was not at Peter's house. It wasn't a thatched roof. And it wasn't a beggar man. The guy who was let down through the roof was let down through the Fora Consortium. And he was a Roman senator by the name of Licinius Apollonius, who was paralyzed on his trip coming from Rome when he was shot in the back by pirates, and it paralyzed him. By the time he got here to visit Herod Antipas, he was paralyzed totally. And so he was the one that was let down through the roof because of the great crowd that came to see Jesus on the religious conference that took place March 6th, 7th, and 8th of the year 28 AD. And so he was healed. It is part of Roman record that was done. And that was right behind us. Right next to it was the primary corda, or the primary road, and in that primary road is where Matthew was called to be a disciple of Jesus at the Board of Taxation, and then we'll get into that when we get down by the seashore even more so. Now, in this particular synagogue, the most outstanding historical event that actually took place is many times treated present-day Christians as kind of a minor event. Most pastors try, whether they admit it or not, we Christian pastors kind of have their pet Jesus stories, and then all the rest. The pet Jesus stories is Jesus walking on the water, the dividing of the fish and the bread, raising of Lazarus, the call of Peter, James, and John, those types of things. But things that are considered to be minor events in Jesus' life, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, the teaching that Jesus had when Pilate mixed the blood of the Galileans with their sacrifice, those types of things you very seldom ever hear any sermons about. But they're still just as important to us because they're part of Jesus' life, part of those 129 events that's been preserved for us. And so one of the great events of Jesus' ministry took place here in this synagogue. Not necessarily these particular rocks were the witnesses, but certainly the foundation that this is built upon was a witness of that event. And that's the healing of the man with the withered hand. And that event perhaps seems maybe insignificant to us in the 21st century in our teachings of Jesus, but as I explain it to you, you will understand it was probably one of the greatest events of Jesus' ministry. The event actually took place many years before the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Herod the Great had the idea to try to make friends with the Jews who hated him with a passion. And to do that, he tried to buy their friendship by actually expanding and enhancing the temple and making it one of the greatest wonders of the world. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, the Temple of Jerusalem should have been the 8th wonder of the ancient world. And the fact that it was not the 8th wonder, that's the 9th wonder, because it was absolutely magnificent. And Herod was, out of his own money, the equivalent of about $1 billion for his own money was spent on the temple. Caesar Augusta gave another from the treasury of Rome, another $1 billion, and then he gave $1 billion from the people of the Jews, which was not voluntary, but through the taxation. And so the entire $3 billion project went into the construction of the temple. Now, Herod was given permission to choose his own engineers, his own construction people, and Herod, in turn, got permission from Caesar Augusta to go throughout the entire empire at that time and choose the very best artisans, the very best stonemasons that were in the world at that time. And he searched for 3 years. During that 3-year period, he chose a man by the name of Yeshua Bensi. He was from a family of priests. Although he was an engineer himself, he was from a family of priests. So he was chosen by Herod to be the project manager, and he's the one that went throughout the world to choose these great stonemasons. Come to find out, after doing the research for 3 years, he found out that the greatest stonemasons in the world were right here, right in this region. And so he chose from the Galilee region, from the Samaria, from the Judea region, 257 stonemasons. And it was their responsibility to build primarily the foundation, the superstructure and substructure of the foundation for the great temple of Herod. And once these men were chosen, then they began their work. And the stones were cut under their supervision, the stones were placed under their supervision, and the foundation and the substructure, superstructure was made for the temple. Now, everything came to a conclusion, and they were just about ready to begin raising the walls and doing the final above-ground work. But Yeshua Bensi wanted to give special recognition to these guys. So he got special permission from Jezar, who was the chief priest, or high priest at that time, to have a special celebration on a Sabbath day to honor these men. And so they set the date, and they were going to give a great celebration. But the Roman governor discovered what was happening, and he did not give his permission. And the reason for it was this, is that Herod the Great had a premonition that he was going to die before the temple was complete, which in fact he did, die in 4 BC. And so because he had this premonition, then he demanded that these stonemasons work in 8-hour shifts around the clock, 24 hours a day, including the Sabbath day, to build these foundations for the temple. He received permission from Jezar, the chief priest or the high priest, to do this, and so consequently they did. So working around the clock, 8-hour shifts, even on the Sabbath day, the foundation was incomplete within the time established. Unfortunately, Herod the Great was dead by then. But his son, who took over, continued the same process. Now the dedication time began. The Roman governor says, no way, this is going to happen. The reason is this: my fortification of Antonia, which is where the Roman military was going to be housed at the west section of the temple, says my foundation is not complete, and your work is not complete until the Roman headquarters is complete. And so if your people can work on the Sabbath day for your temple, you absolutely will work on the Sabbath day for my fortification. And so then Yeshua Bensi had to go back to the high priest again. This time the high priest was Eleazar. It had changed hands, so Eleazar then gave his permission and issued what was called the Sabbath of Weeks. The Sabbath of Weeks allowed the stonemasons to work an additional 126 Sabbath days until the project was complete. And during that time, it was complete. Finally, everything was done, including the Tower of Antonia. So there was a celebration given on the next Sabbath day with the high priest with his blessings. And they invited all the family members and dignitaries and husband or wives and children and so forth to this great celebration that was being held in the temple square that, certainly before the walls were up, but within the foundational region. And Yeshua ben Si wanted to draw attention to how good this work was, and it was magnificent. So at sunrise on this particular Sabbath, with all these hundreds and thousands of people gathered around, he drew attention. The altar was not complete, but it was high enough so he could stand on it. So he stood up there and gave special attention to the work. And he said that these guys have done a tremendous job, and isn't it wonderful what they have done? And it's magnificent. And everyone agreed and said, okay, now we have our celebration. So they brought out the food and this type of thing. 12 o'clock noon, or midday, what they call high day, which is to us midday, he stood up on the altar again, and again called special recognition for what they have done. And he made this statement. He said, even though these stonemasons had to work on the Sabbath day, which is forbidden by our law, which is worthy of death by our law, but because they were working on the temple, then they will not be punished and they will not be worthy of death. And then he made this statement. But for working for the Romans on the Sabbath day, you will be punished. You should have refused to work and face death rather than to work for the Romans. Even though the high priest says it was permitted, you know that it must not be permitted. And for working for the Romans, you will be punished. And at that, the right hand of all 257 stonemasons were crushed, destroying their livelihood from that time forward. And not only that, the wives of those stonemasons, they had their right eye gouged out, their right thumb cut off, their right breast cut off, their right big toe cut off. And they were forced to work from that time forward in the garbage dump of Gehenna in Jerusalem, taking care of the fires, taking care of the garbage. Never allowed again to set foot in Jerusalem or to set eyes on their family. The children, both feet cut off, both hands removed, both eyes gouged out. And they had to be beggars in the streets of Jerusalem for the rest of their life. The high priest made a proclamation called the stonemasons' disallowance, the Rizeza Ezakasian, the stonemasons' disallowance. And with that, he said that these stonemasons, because they did not respect the law, they broke the law of the Sabbath, then they become an enemy of God. And they become an enemy of God's people. That their sin will never be forgiven in this life or in the life to come. They will be sinners, they will be damned for all of eternity. And this, if they take their own life to escape the penalty, then the penalty would be passed down for 3 generations. They were never allowed to see their family ever again, their wife ever again. And from that time forward, the stonemason had to go back to his particular city, wherever it was, whether it be Capernaum, whether it be Bethany, whether it was Shechem, Hebron, Jericho, and his local synagogue. He was forced every Sabbath day to sit against the north wall, this wall. Sit against that wall with his head down. He wore a red cloth around his right arm from that time forward for the rest of his life to identify who he was. He was never allowed from that time forward to make eye contact with anyone, even when he met them on the street. Never allowed to talk to anyone, and no one was allowed to talk to him to receive a response. And every Sabbath day, as he was against that north wall, the leader of the Sabbath meeting, the leader of the synagogue, would point out every Sabbath day, every day, point to this man and to say, this is what God does to those who break his law. He is cursed. He is hated of God. He is hated of mankind. And this is what happens. On that Sabbath day that we're talking about, one of those stonemasons was in the Sabbath in this synagogue sitting against that wall. When Jesus arrived from the northern opening of the synagogue. And that day, everybody knew who the man was. It had now been more than 25 years since it happened. The hand was by now all shriveled up and worthless, of no good. No one had spoken to this man for 25 years. No one had looked at him eye to eye. And the only speaking that he had ever received was an absolute ridicule and disdain from anyone. No one had embraced him. No one had given him any amount of encouragement whatsoever. Hadn't seen his family for 25 years, had no idea anything about them. But on this day, when Jesus walked into this synagogue, it was going to be a different day for that man. Everybody knew who he was. Maybe not by name, but they knew why he was there. He was there as a curse, as an example of what God does to sinners. He was there because the high priest had commissioned him to be an enemy of God. And there was no forgiving of his sin ever. There was no healing for his body, because to heal his body meant that God had forgiven him. And because God would never forgive him, there would never be any healing. On that day, Jesus walked in. Some of the Pharisees were here, the scribes, the religious leaders. And Jesus, for the first time in 25 years, was the first man to look at this man and really look at him. And for the first time in 25 years, someone spoke to him on something other than disdain. And Jesus said, "Sir, stand up." And then Jesus referred back to that very fateful day 25 years before. And he asked these religious leaders, said, on the Sabbath day, is it okay to give life or to take life? In other words, is it okay to work for the temple and yet destroy a man and his family? Which one is correct to do on the Sabbath day in God's house? And I'm sure these religious leaders were thinking to themselves, we know this man. We've heard about him. He's the one that talks to sinners. And can you imagine, he's even letting a woman touch him before. We know this guy, but even he, as a rebel as he is, even he would not countermand a direct pronouncement by the high priest himself. Even he would not counterbalance a decree from God's spokesman. And then Jesus looked at the man. And for only the second time in 25 years, he was spoken to in a voice that was kind, in a voice that was moving. And he said, "Sir, stretch forth your hand." And to show that not only did Jesus have the ability to heal, but he had the ability to remove a curse that they felt only God could give. The man stretched his hand out and was healed totally and completely. And now, is there any wonder why the Word of God tells us that these religious leaders, these Pharisees, were so angry, so burned up inside, so beside themselves, that they went out and consulted how they were going to kill him?